Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Kaufman. I'm executive editor at Doubleday. Welcome to this Google Hangout on Air with best-selling author and my friend, Dan Brown.
Hi, everybody.
Dan, I was going to start out by asking you about celebrity and how it's changed your life. And yet, when we walked into Google, and by the way, getting into Google is like coming into a fortress. You need your IDs, you need everything. And Dan said to the security guard, I'm sorry, I don't have my ID. I forgot my wallet. But luckily, we had a copy of the book. So how has celebrity changed your life? What did you do downstairs?
Well, the great thing about celebrity in this case is I forgot my ID, but I had one. There were a whole bunch of them printed and released today in the mass market form. So they let us in. It was kind of funny. They let us in, and this gentleman behind the counter, a young man, said, "Oh, you're Dan Brown. Well, I'm an author too. I write science fiction, and can you give me any tips?" That was pretty amusing.
That's true. Well, Dan and I have been working together for about 16 years, which is a little bit hard to believe at this point, but 16 years and over the span of many, many books. And this guy downstairs asked an interesting question. It was something I was going to ask you, which is I'm sure you get asked all the time, advice from writers, aspiring writers, and how do I get into the business and how do I write and how do I choose subjects?
Mm-hmm.
And the typical wisdom is write what you know. You hear that all the time. And
I
you were
think
asked
the exact opposite
45 minutes ago, right. And what did you say to him?
It's funny. Everybody will tell you write what you know, and I believe the exact opposite. I think that you should write what you want to know, and that means that if you have a topic that you're excited about, that you're passionate about, go out and find everything you can find out about that topic, and then write it. Let your own intellectual curiosity, your own experience learning about this topic be the catalyst for writing an exciting book. Books take a year, two, sometimes six. There was one book I wrote that took 6 years. Sorry.
We won't talk about that.
We're not speaking about that one. But it's very difficult to stay interested that long in a topic. So you need to choose something that you're excited about and something you don't know everything about, such that you learn every single day. So, that's my advice to write about what you're hoping to learn about.
And it's interesting because that really leads into another thing that I thought we'd talk about today, which is the idea of research. And my list at Doubleday at Random House and many of the editors who work there, we publish a lot of novels, we publish a lot of nonfiction, and for the most part, writers who spend the most time researching are nonfiction writers. Sure. Because you're writing a history of World War II, you're writing some obscure subject, and it takes a lot of research. There aren't really that many fiction writers who spend a lot of time, and certainly not nearly at the level that I know that you spend. So you're talking about write what you don't know. Those two things kind of go hand in hand, because in order to write what you don't know, you really need to spend enormous number of hours researching, and that's a huge part of your process. Do you want to?
Yeah, I certainly knew a fair amount about Dante before I started writing Inferno. I knew very little about genetic engineering. I knew a fair amount about Florence, but I needed to know a lot about all three of those things. And as far as Florence goes, that took obviously a research trip. So you always want to write about some place that you want to go. And when it comes to at least the way I write, place, a sense of place in these novels for me is as important as a character. It really is a character. And so I want to set scenes in locations that are exciting to me, whether it's in this book, whether it's the baptistry or Bobley Gardens or some other place that we won't reveal. That is as important as a character. And so I need to get to know that character by visiting those places. And Jason and I took a bunch of research trips, and one to Florence was particularly amusing because there's always this cat and mouse game. We're trying very hard to keep it a secret, what a book is about, but you end up with a curator who is thrilled to show you around because he thinks, wow, Dan's going to write about whatever this museum is or whatever this painting is. But we don't want him to know that. We're afraid, at the end of the day, he'll say, Dan Brown was just here, he asked me about this, and so we know what he's writing about. So what I usually do is I ask 10 questions, maybe 2 of them have anything to do with what I want, and 8 of them are about something totally different. So I asked this poor curator 8 questions about Machiavelli and took careful notes, and then just asked him a few things offhand about Dante. And
it was very interesting. I remember we probably listened to a 45-minute lecture on Machiavelli.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful.
Yeah,
But I'm
very
not sure there was
efficient.
more than a line in the book about
No,
Machiavelli.
there wasn't. I was trying
But
to take a
well,
little
that
short.
research trip was it was enormously enlightening, but it was very fun in many ways. There was this day that we had been given access to the Palazzo Vecchio, this incredible old. It was one of the fortresses really built by the Medici family. Um, so we were there, and everything was closed, and we were taking a tour. And by the time we were concluding our tour, it had opened to the public, and so there were many tourists who were there. But we were being given this secret hallways and secret passageways tour, and so we were in the back in some area that the public was not allowed, which was wonderful. And I guess there must have been a rumor in the building that Dan Brown was there, and so people were sort of looking around and poking around. And I don't want to give anything away from the book, but there's a room in Palazzo Vecchio with let's just say, large piece of art that actually swings open and functions as a doorway. And behind there are all these other passageways. And we were in the back area, and we were finishing our tour, and we came back, and they said, okay, here's how you get back into the main area. And I just remember you pushing the door open and stepping through it. What did you see when you stepped out?
So I'm stepping through a secret doorway, which on the other side is a massive work of art with all these tourists looking at it. So they're looking at this piece of art. All of a sudden, it swings open, and I step out of the wall at the Palazzo Vecchio, and everybody's taking pictures saying, this is really strange. I think Dan Brown just stepped out of the wall.
It was an amazing moment. You just knew that there were a lot of people who had this great experience of saying,
Right.
there I am at Palazzo Vecchio, and Dan Brown steps out through a painting. And
Yeah,
it was perfect.
that was fun.
We were talking, mentioning Inferno, and this is an exciting week because Inferno is out in paperback, and you think back to last year when the book came out in hardcover, and became really I believe it was the #1 best-selling book of the year across the world last year, which is always exciting, I'm sure. I mean, does that resonate with you in every single book and in the same way?
Of course it resonates. I have very clear memories of writing books that didn't sell, of working incredibly hard on my first book, Digital Fortress. Really there was a bookstore, my hometown bookstore, Water Street Bookstore, Dan Chartrand, and they let us put up window displays and try to sell this book. My wife and I pooled what little money we had and took out an ad in a magazine called Radio, TV, and News Report. And I offered to give radio interviews to talk about the National Security Agency. Strangely, Digital Fortress was really the Edward Snowden story, almost 20 years before it happened. We didn't know at the time that obviously that it would happen, but it was a little bit, it was very high tech, a little bit ahead of its time. And everybody on the radio wanted to talk about it. And so that's really the only way we sold the book, was to go, and we did it all ourselves. And so I have that very clear recollection of writing books that nobody read. And of course, after Da Vinci Code came out, everybody went back and read Digital Fortress and Angels and Demons, The Deception Point, and the others. So
yeah, I remember well.
I will say to the writers out there that, at least in my experience, and also I think the experience I've heard from other writers, is that success really doesn't, it changes your life slightly, but it does not change the process in any way. You still face a blank piece of paper or a blank computer screen, and your characters still need the same amount of work. You still have to do the same research. And I think there's probably a perception that, wow, once I have a hit book, it's got to be much easier. And the reality is, it isn't. The process is identical. And in some ways, it's a little bit harder because there's quite a bit of pressure and expectation. That's not a complaint. I don't want to go back to writing books that didn't sell, but it isn't the cure-all.
But it's true, and actually, there's a very common question that I get for you, really, which is people say to me, so does Dan feel incredible pressure starting a new book? And once you've written about the bloodline of Jesus, and once you have gone inside the secret archives of the Vatican, and once you've taken on these huge subjects that have become worldwide conversation pieces, many times I've been asked, how does he possibly write a new book?
Yeah.
And I was actually going to say to you, I was thinking about Inferno recently now with the paperback. Everything starts with just a a kernel of an idea.
It does.
And Inferno, there's a huge motif. I mean, there's Dante and there's Florence and there's overpopulation, and all those eventually melded together and turned into a very suspenseful novel. But at the beginning, I do remember the very first conversation about Inferno that we were having, which was years ago, walking on a beach, talking about, you had this great idea about how to start a new Langdon novel in a different way, where Robert Langdon would wake up with amnesia. You remember this?
I do. Yeah, it was Venice Beach. We walked it about, it must have been 8 or 9 times back and forth talking about this. 1,000 times.
Yes.
I just thought how Langdon always starts these novels in a very clear state of mind. His intellect is his tool. His knowledge, his ability to think, is his weapon. And I thought, why not start a novel where he's entirely stripped of that weapon? Why not start a novel where he wakes up with amnesia, has no idea where he is, what's happened to him, how it happened, and very suddenly he finds out he's in peril and people are trying to kill him, and he's also carrying a strange artifact. And that artifact is really his only key to figuring out why he's in trouble. And I just thought that was a very strong idea. And I'd known for a long time that I wanted to write about Dante. That I read the Divine Comedy as a senior in high school, and actually don't remember much of it, but remember thinking, wow, this is a very modern story. It feels very modern for something written in the 1300s. And you remember these conversations, trying to figure out, how do you make Dante, how do you make an epic poem from the 1300s relevant to the modern reader, to the modern world? And we came up with this idea that Dante is the focus point of a villain, that there's a villain who's a Dante fanatic, and he believes that the picture that Dante paints in Inferno, this horrific landscape of fire and brimstone and overpopulation and dead bodies everywhere, that this villain believes that is not history, but rather prophecy. That he believes the message of Dante is, if we keep going the way we're going, that's what the world's going to look like. And that was really the way in, the way to make Dante Alighieri.
I remember that was probably a conversation at 5 in, because you work very early.
I do.
And I work very late, which is odd and
ironic.
Funny. That we work together.
We pass on email. I'm just getting up and you're just going to bed.
That's true. But when I come up to visit you, then I get on your schedule. We work early, and I remember that conversation about what if this character looked at Dante's work as a prophecy for the future.
Right.
It's very interesting to see how it comes together and then turns into something that, the overpopulation issue was not even involved at that point, but it ended up coming in. What was the piece that interested you about overpopulation?
Well, actually, my interest in overpopulation came from one statistic that I heard, which was essentially that in the last 80 years, the population on the planet has tripled. That if you know somebody who's 80 years old, they were born onto a planet that had 1/3 as many people. I thought, that is staggering. I just can't believe that's true. And I ended up talking to a lot of scientists, maybe ecologists, and really started to realize that a lot of these global problems that we're feeling, you look at the New York Times, whether it was today or yesterday, the main story was this newly released information on the environment, like that everything's changing. All these issues of pollution, changing temperatures, no clean water, these are really just symptoms of overpopulation. Those are not the problems themselves. Those are symptoms of overpopulation. And it really, what chilled me was this idea of a villain who decides, you know what, everybody's blind and doesn't see this, and to save the world, I'm just going to take care of it. If I could just eradicate a whole lot of people, maybe that would be helpful. And those are the villains I like, the villains who do the wrong thing for the right reason. And that's where it came about.
So choosing villains, I know that's important to you, and I was also going to ask you a certain point here about setting, because it is such an important part of all the books that you've done, and even the Langdon books, but even the non-Langdon books. Deception Point, takes place on the Milne ice shelf, and it is this stark, forbidding environment. When you choose a place like Florence, because we've actually never talked about this. I mean, you'll call and say, I'm thinking Florence. There's all this great stuff there, but is it that you choose a city and think this would be a great place to set a book, or is it that you are researching topics and find that they all intersect at a city?
It's the latter. They have to intersect. You can't just sort of say, "Wow, I love whatever. I love New York City. Now I got to figure out what to write here."
Right.
It will usually come the other way. I mean, Dante was really the catalyst for this book, and you can't write about Dante without setting a book in Florence, and that's where all the art is. That's where he lived. And I remember, I don't know if you remember this moment. We were in the baptistry of San Giovanni, and if you've read Inferno, you know that Dante describes the devil, Satan, as having three heads, these three mouths,
Yeah.
where he's constantly gnashing. These teeth are gnashing sinners, just three at a time. And I thought, like, what a horrific image of Satan. How does Dante come up with something like that? And so we're in the baptistry, and I'm looking up at the ceiling, and there's this massive blue Satan with three mouths.
Oh, it's terrifying.
I said that's from Inferno. And the historian who was there, she was wonderful, said, "Oh yes, well, Dante was baptized in this church, and he came to church services here every Sunday, and as a little kid he looked up at that." I said, how incredible is that? That's what inspired the vision of hell that we have today. And as you know, before Dante, there wasn't much. The picture of hell was not very clear. The Bible talked about hell in very loose terms. Greek mythology did a little bit more, but Dante was the one who really pulled it all together and created this very sort of codified, vivid, specific, terrifying vision of hell that we still have today. When we say fire and brimstone, and you have those pictures of hell, that's Dante.
That's true. It was fascinating. I wanted to ask you, because we are going to take some questions. We have some readers who are going to be asking us questions shortly. Before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about some of the other books, and let's talk about Da Vinci Code, because Da Vinci Code was really the book, the moment where everything changed. Before Da Vinci Code, the other books that you wrote, the other books that we worked on, they were terrific thrillers.
You can be honest. My mom bought a copy, and that might
Your
have been,
mom bought a copy.
might have been it.
I think my mom got a free copy.
Okay, exactly.
But they were fantastic books that have now held up
Sure.
and become very, very successful.
Yeah.
But up to that point, there really had not been a lot of success. The book sold okay. It's a difficult business. Publishing is hard. It's difficult to get noticed. I was going to ask about the writing process of the three of now all the books, but leading up to Da Vinci Code, to me there was something that felt a little bit different about that book and the process and the research and everything that fed into it. It just felt like you really were onto something incredible. Did it feel that way to you? I don't think I ever asked you that.
Absolutely. It's that book for me was more than any other books a journey of discovery. I mean, when I started that book, if you'd said, I heard this theory that Jesus and Mary Magdalene might have been married. I said, well, that's totally ridiculous. How could that possibly be true? That's where I started the research. And I ended with, I cannot believe that Jesus and Mary Magdalene clearly had some kind of relationship, were very, very connected, and it is entirely opposite what I was taught in church, and I grew up in a very religious family. So there for me was this incredible sort of an epiphany, an enlightenment, and I felt eager to share that in a way. And it wasn't my theory. This theory had been out quite a while.
But you do that very well. You end up finding things that are there. You don't invent things, but you find facts and theories and pieces of history that, you've always said history belongs to the winners, and people who write the history are those people who have triumphed throughout history. But if you look at all the theories in Da Vinci Code, all of it has been widely reported. I mean, to this day, it's funny because now that book is 10 years ago. It's sort of hard to believe. But in these last 10 years, there have been some pretty major discoveries that really point exactly to what you talk about in the book. And that's something I think to me it seems like it's something that makes you unique and makes you who you are. You are very, very capable in terms of pulling everything together and then not only putting on the page but weaving it into something that is actually suspenseful and that actually comes out in the form of a very entertaining thriller.
Mm.
But that is something that not everyone can do. When you go into it, do you feel like you have a map ahead of time, or do you find it?
Well, you have to. You can't start writing until you have structure and a map, and you can't start writing until you know the end. But certainly when I started researching the Da Vinci Code, I didn't know what it was going to look like. I had no idea what the novel was going to look like. And as I started amassing the research, things start to appear. You start learning about things like Opus Dei and the Last Supper, and you start saying, oh, and there's this rumor about the Prior of Sion. You start pulling these elements in, and you start to realize what the ingredients, the most exciting ingredients, could be to write this book. And it's really not until then that you can start to create your outline. And certainly, I would never want to imply that you can start to write a book without knowing the outline. That is a very good recipe for disaster. And these books especially are so, they're plotted. There's a lot going on.
They're complicated.
They're complicated books. And if Inferno, if I had started Inferno without knowing the end, I would have painted myself into the corner with no way out, and essentially had to call you and say, you know what, the last 2 years of my life I just wasted. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, that leads us now to the time where we are going to actually take some questions. We have some readers who are hooked up here with us in the Hangout, and let's see who we're going to go to first here. Oh, it's Chelsea. Okay, Chelsea Langford. Hi, Chelsea.
Hey, Chelsea.
Hi, Dan. I'm Chelsea from Kirkus, and of course I've read Inferno and have a few questions for you.
I have a question for you first.
Okay.
Why haven't you ever given me a starred review? It really would have helped me through.
I was worried that this was going to happen. It's not my fault.
I'm sorry. I didn't interrupt. Go ahead.
So I'm kind of interested. We started this conversation talking about celebrity and how, as your books become bestsellers and become so popular, it becomes more important to take precautions to ensure that the material is kept secret and you don't have leaks before the book comes out. So I wanted to know what precautions you have to take to kind of ensure that your material is kept secret, and how does that affect your writing process? Has that really changed for you?
Yeah, great question. It's actually changed a lot. There was a time, when I was starting out that I was lucky if anybody would talk to me. If I called the Louvre and said, "Hey, I'd like to come and talk to you," nobody would talk to me. And now I'm very fortunate that I have access to people and locations. But as we said earlier, it's difficult because you want to be very, very secret about what you're writing about. Once you actually get the information, there's this challenge of saying, okay, well, now I'm writing a book and I'm researching on the internet, which is all traceable. I'm having phone conversations with specialists, and I have to trust that they are not turning around and talking to people about what I'm writing about. So those are two challenges. And then if you can find, and I should say that I write I research on one computer, and I write on a computer that is not attached to the internet. I don't. It's not paranoid. It's just. Well, maybe it is paranoid. It's careful.
Realistic.
It's realistic. Mm-hmm. So my actual manuscript is on a computer that is not connected to the internet in any way, as far as I know. And the real challenge comes once the manuscript is complete. We publish in 50 some odd languages around the world, and maybe 10 to 15 of those languages we publish simultaneously, which means, for example, if you're publishing in French, you need to take your completed manuscript and give it to your French publisher such that they can translate it, maybe 2 months in advance, such that they can publish on the same day. But you have just handed over a finished manuscript in a foreign country, maybe 10 or 15 foreign countries. And in the case of Inferno, there was a real military operation. There were literally two, they called them bunkers, and you should have seen these places. There was one in Milan and one in the UK. They were armed guards, and there were computers where they could do research, but somebody was watching what they did. They couldn't bring in cell phones. Everything had to be done in that room, and it all worked. I mean, this book came out in more than a dozen languages, I think, on the same day with no leaks. But it's a good question. It was not easy. There was quite a bit of technology and secrecy that went into it.
And that kind of leads me to a second question about your plot for Inferno. To me, seemed like it involved even more stakes, and that the conflict was on a very large scale. You have a plague that can potentially affect all of humanity. So your plot it's not it really involves the whole world, and that's a big task to take on as a writer. So as your books become more popular and you're getting this positive feedback from your readers, do you find that you're feeling more comfortable taking more risks as a writer, or is that something that you want to do as you continue to write Langdon novels, that you want to push yourself further and make the stories even bigger than they've been before?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I think the answer is that a little bit of both. I don't think you can continually do anything, whether you're practicing an instrument or a sport or whatever, without getting better at it and without wanting to do more and more, without wanting to take some chances. Strangely, though, I mean, I'd argue that the Da Vinci Code also affected the whole world. You're talking about possibly undermining the foundations of Christianity, or I guess Angels and Demons was similar. That there was some information that if it came out, it would affect an enormous part of the population. But clearly, Inferno is on the peril there is on an enormous level. And I did take some pretty big chances, especially in writing the ending. There were a couple of endings, and the ending that I put in the novel is the one I really wanted to write. I'm really happy I did, and the readers have responded very, very well to it. But it's a little different than my previous endings. It's not quite so neat and tidy. It's a little bit more realistic. And I'm proud of it. And I think maybe you're right that the success of some of the previous books gave me, I think, the confidence to say, you know what, this is the way I think the book should end, and this is how I'm going to do it.
All right, thanks, Chelsea. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Great to talk to you.
You too,
Good talking to you. Okay, we have a question coming in now from Matt Staggs. Hi, Matt.
Matt, you
Matt,
have to unmute yourself.
Are you on mute, Matt?
I'm not on mute. Can you hear me okay?
Now we hear you.
Got you.
Sorry about that. I wanted to ask you, Dan, what is it like to have become an idiomatic writer? I've seen people before, like journalists, say, in a story that could seem right in place in a Dan Brown novel, or you won't believe this, it's like something out of the Da Vinci Code. What is it like to become a living idiom like that?
Well, now that you mention it, it's kind of daunting. I never thought of it. Thanks a lot, Matt. You know what? I'm not sure what that really means when somebody says, pulled out of the pages of a Dan Brown novel. I think what I hope it means is that they're referring to something, probably to something conspiratorial, to something that might deal with art or religion that is actually real, but it's also highly entertaining. You look at whatever's happening with the new pope. You look at what's happening with genetic engineering. I guess I would choose to take it as a compliment. That may be naive, but I think it's nice that somebody might say that.
Well, if you have time for a second question, I'd like to ask you one more. I've heard you say that a lot of the organizations and people in your most recent novel are actually real, or based on real people. And frankly, it's a little frightening. The organization at root behind one of the biggest plot elements in your book is kind of scary. Are you sure you don't want to say that's not real? Because I'm not going to be able to sleep at night very well.
I mean, you've probably done a little research and know that organizations exactly like them exist on all sorts of different levels. They are absolutely real, and some of them even advertise agencies like that and organizations like that. I don't want to give it away for anybody who hasn't read the book, but I choose real places, real art, real documents, real organizations because it for me, it makes the books a lot more fun to write because I'm learning about the real world. One secret that I don't admit very often, you know this, of course, is that I don't read a lot of fiction. I read almost exclusively nonfiction because I like to learn about the real world. And I think it's almost like these books are written for people kind of like me who may read a lot of nonfiction, like to learn, but also like to be entertained. And I had an old lady come to me once and say, Mr. Brown, your books, they remind me of eating my vegetables, but it tastes like dessert. And I thought, wow, that's actually a pretty nice compliment. It essentially means that I'm learning something, but I'm having some fun. So I just thought that was a nice thing for somebody to say.
All right, thanks very much, Matt.
Thank you.
I believe we have another reader. Oh, yes, Sarah.
Sarah Connell.
Hi, Sarah Connell. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. So yeah, I do work at your hometown bookstore.
Yeah. Good to see
And so I meet probably an even higher than usual number of Dan Brown fans in my day-to-day life. And actually, kind of coming out of your last question, one of the things that I've noticed from working at the bookstore is that you have a lot of different kinds of readers. So some people just sort of pick up the book and they're really interested in the plot and they're just turning the pages. And then some people will kind of pause and look up the things and, especially like maybe works of art or things that you're referencing. I know we have people who absolutely adore the illustrated editions.
Sure.
So when you're thinking about all the different ways that people are going to be reading your books, do you sort of have an ideal reader in mind? Do you just sort of try and reach as many different kind of readers as possible?
Wow, that's Sarah, I do have an answer. I do have an ideal reader in mind, and not to sound self-centered, but the ideal reader is me. I'm just writing a book that I would want to read. When you're a creative person, all you have is your own taste. You write something that you like, and you hope other people like it. Those people who like it are your fans. Those who don't are your critics. I like books that have big ideas. I like books that have a lot of art. And so I think the answer to your question is just there are a lot of people who share my taste, and I'm very fortunate. I'm glad you mentioned the illustrated. Jason, if he looks a little tired, it's because he's working really hard right now on the illustrated edition, and I'm not going to take any credit for it. He's doing all of the work.
Excellent material to work with.
And then my other question is that one of the things that I really liked about Inferno is how closely it is related to, Dante and then the kind of the tradition that followed him. And without sort of asking if you felt like writing it was a descent into hell, how much did you sort of align what you were doing with that kind of the tradition of Dante writers, and also obviously there are ways in which your own writing is doing very similar things to what Dante does, and I thought that was one of the coolest things to spot in the book.
Well, that makes me so happy that you say that, because there are a lot of parallels. I mean, I very intentionally created structural things and thematic things, and even linguistic things that parallel, the Divine Comedy. And I thought, well, someone like you might see them all, and somebody else might not, and that's okay. One of the things that fascinates me about the Divine Comedy, and particularly Inferno, is that other than the Bible, no other piece of literature in history has spawned more art and literature, more spin-offs than Dante. And video games are based on Dante's Inferno. It is an incredibly enduring and I guess you could say an inspirational piece of work. The people are still deriving inspiration from it. I know that I certainly did. It was a dark place to spend a couple of years in that book, and certainly if you're writing a book about genetic engineering and you're starting to realize, wow, we're at a place in genetic engineering that what I'm writing about really could happen, absolutely could happen. It was kind of a dark time to write this book, and so I think you're right. It was a little bit of a descent into hell, and it's nice to be back in the light of day.
Thank you.
Okay. My next book will be about puppies and rainbows or something. I'll need a palate cleanser after this one.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all the readers and everybody who's been watching and asking questions. Thank you to Dan.
Thanks to Jason.
Thank you to Google. We really appreciate being here, and we'll see you soon.
We'll hang out another time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.